Sorry. How are you today?
I'm fine, thanks. How are you?
I'm good. Thank you for agreeing to this interview. I appreciate it. Um, I'm Amy, as you know.
I know, yes.
What would you state your full name, please?
My name is Robert Lionel Rockland.
Are you okay if I take some notes?
Of course.
And what year were you born?
I was born in 1946.
Okay. How was that?
That was the beginning of the baby boom.
Okay.
In fact, I think it was the very first year of the baby boom, so I'm an early boomer.
And you said what year was that again?
1946.
1946. Where were you born, if I may ask?
Yes, I was born at Beth Israel Hospital in Newark, New Jersey.
New Jersey. How was it up there?
Well, I was very young at the time, so I couldn't say for sure. But I lived in New Jersey for most of my life, and I like New Jersey. Um, it's cold in the winter, though, so North Carolina is a lot warmer, and I would not move back to New Jersey, even though I liked it a lot.
Okay, that's understandable. Um, what is your earliest memory?
Well, they say that you can't really remember anything before about the age of 4 or 5, but I do have some very fragmentary memories from earlier than that. In particular, I remember a time I was probably 3 years old, bundled up in heavy, bulky winter clothes. And I was holding my mother's hand, and we were walking to visit someone who lived a block or so away. And I remember that the person lived on Osborne Terrace. And from the way my mother spoke about Osborne Terrace, my impression was that it was something special, that these were rich people, maybe even kings, that lived on Osborne Terrace. Although, in fact, it was just a middle class or working class neighborhood, no different from the place that we lived in.
Also,
But
I
then
apologize. How should I address you? I should have asked this to begin with.
um, you should call me Rob. You could, if you want, you can call me Your Majesty, but you would be the only one that does that.
um,
Most people call me Rob. But moving on to more concrete memories, um, when I was 5 years old, going to kindergarten, I had a best friend, Marty Packin, who lived next door, and he and I used to walk to school together. And in the fall, all the leaves would come down from the trees and they would pile up in the gutter, basically next to the sidewalk. And all the kids from school, including Marty and me, would parade down the street, walking through the leaves and listening to them crunch under our feet. I can still sort of feel what that felt like and remember the sound of it and the smell of it. That's a very vivid memory, and that's a 73-year-old memory.
it sounds like so much fun. Um, how was school throughout your childhood? I mean, I would think it looks much different than it does now.
Um, I imagine it does. We had real slate blackboards in those days, and and erasing the blackboard and clapping the erasers were special treats for the kids that behaved the best in class. Not everybody got to erase the board, or even better yet, to wash it with a wet sponge. That was a real treat. We didn't do stuff like that at home. Didn't want to wash anything.
I
But at
can
school,
imagine.
washing the blackboards was a big thing. It was something I got to do actually fairly often, not because of good behavior. I certainly didn't earn it on that score, but because I was much taller than most of the other kids and I could reach higher on the blackboard than most of the other kids could.
Now tell me, how was the sound of chalkboard on the
That was
blackboard?
what?
How could you stand the sound of chalk on the
Oh,
chalkboard?
most of the time it sounds fine. Um, there are certain times when if the teacher hits it just wrong, it makes that awful chattering noise. Some of the kids in the class had really strong reactions to that. I didn't. And part of that may have to do with the fact that I think my hearing, as you know, is very poor. I think I had poor hearing as a child, but I think they failed to diagnose it because the hearing tests that they gave us in elementary school were very crude. They didn't tell much, and I think it just slipped right past them. But I probably I would imagine that my performance in school was probably affected by poor hearing, and I didn't realize it at the time. Although in those days, um, thinking back to like third and fourth grade, particularly, it seemed to me that the teachers, their main concern with most of the students was not whether they understood arithmetic or could read maps or any of that stuff. It was how neat was your handwriting. And mine was terrible.
The
So,
cursive.
yeah. So the kids with good handwriting were the ones that got the best grades. And my handwriting was awful, so I did not get good grades. Um, Speaking of cursive, they taught cursive writing, the Palmer method, in second grade. And I was out the day that the teacher taught how to do a capital Q. And I knew later on, because it was up there on the wall, that a capital Q looks like a great big number two. But I absolutely refused to accept it. And I continued to use a printed Q for a capital Q. But fortunately, you very rarely have to write a capital Q, especially in second grade. So I never got called on it. But I still refused to make a great big two instead of a proper Q.
Do you feel like um, the troubles you faced in grade school impacted you later on in life?
Um, Not really. Not really. I had a wonderful teacher in the sixth grade. Miss Knudsen was her name. Although later she married a man named Shamblin and became Mrs. Shamblin. But Miss Knudsen told us at the beginning of the year, I never give a grade higher than C in the first marking period. So everybody can work their way up from there. And then first marking period report cards came out, and I got 7 A's, expecting a card full of C's. And that was the first time that I ever started to believe in myself as a possibly reasonably intelligent person. Then later that year, the town decided that they were going to implement an experimental program starting in the seventh grade. They were going to have an accelerated class where kids would they would start algebra in seventh grade instead of ninth, and they would start foreign languages in seventh grade instead of ninth, and they would start biology in seventh grade instead of ninth. So she nominated me to be tested for that class, and I was accepted into it. And then, of course, I began to feel like, hey, yeah, I must be really smart. We all thought we were geniuses. We called ourselves the genius class, which must have annoyed the hell out of everybody else in the school.
I honestly think I might have done something similar as a kid. I was in what they called gifted classes.
Yeah.
Then.
Yeah. Well, this was before the term gifted came into use. Yeah. But this was a class that sent kids to Harvard and Princeton and Yale and all of the Ivies. I went to Cornell myself My best friend, or second best friend, one of my two best friends, Jeffrey, went to Harvard. Um, uh, Dan Stroll, who's a part of our periodic reunion group, went to Duke. Charles Bernstein went to University of Pennsylvania. So we went to good schools, and we all, for the most part, did very well afterward. Um, but um, in high school, we were probably a super pain in the neck.
I feel like everyone that you're kind of coming into yourself at that time.
Yes,
Puberty, all that's going on or starting to go on, and it's just a mess.
right. Yeah.
Can you tell me about your teen years, like your adolescence? Like, how was that? I know you said that you started that essentially gifted program in the seventh grade. How old were you about then?
Seventh grade, I would have been 13.
Okay, so you're just hitting that adolescence period. How did that impact your high school years?
Um, well, actually, the biggest impact to me was a negative impact.
Okay.
Even though the classes were good, they kept us all together. There were 29 students, and in seventh grade and eighth grade, they kept us all together. And ninth through 12th, we weren't together all the time, but we were together much more than we otherwise would have been. My graduating class had 435 kids in it. Most of the kids in that graduating class had social relationships, personal relationships with lots of other people. We were kind of closed off from that. So most of us had much smaller social circles. And as a result, I got to know fewer people, um, probably failed to develop the same social skills that I would have developed if I had been exposed to more of the other kids in the school. So I think that was not the best thing. Um, Maybe for me it wasn't so bad because I'm probably not the most sociable person in the world to begin with. But um, but I think that socialization in school is extremely important, and I didn't get enough of that.
Do you think it impacted like you later on in your life and career as well?
Probably, probably because um, I don't I don't relate to other people as easily as many other people do. I just came back from a visit with my brother-in-law. He keeps in touch with dozens and dozens of people from going like all the way back to elementary school, maintains wonderful relationships. He's involved at Florida Tech, which is where he went to school. And he and I went there for an event. And half the people on the campus knew who he was and stopped to talk to him. So obviously has great social skills. I could never do that. I wouldn't know where to begin.
Hey, well, don't feel bad. I think I kind of fit right into this family considering I don't have free social skills.
it, it's hard. In business, I often found myself in a position where I was in like a client meeting, often an event type thing where we would take a bunch of clients on a jaunt for a weekend or something like that. And there would be a large number of clients there, as well as a fairly good sized contingent of our salespeople. I'm there representing marketing, but part of the way I viewed my responsibility in this situation is to socialize with the clients, try to build relationships with them, try to make sure that they have a good time. That's the purpose of this thing. And um, it was a struggle to do that. I had to force myself to do it. Oddly enough, I often found that the salespeople who should have been doing that themselves would gather in a corner and talk among themselves instead of going out
Typical.
and working with their clients. But that sort of thing comes very naturally to some people, and it never came naturally to me.
Can you tell me what your family was like during your childhood and adolescence? Did you have like siblings? What were your living conditions like?
Yeah,
Oh,
I had an older brother. He was 2.5 years older than me. He passed away last year.
I'm sorry.
Um, and it was a typical nuclear family, a mother and father and two kids. My father worked hard. He was he was part owner of a wholesale drug company. He worked fairly long days, even to the point of making deliveries on his way home to some of his customers. Um, so he would get home at night, eat dinner, go up into the den, sit down in his chair, turn on the TV, open up a book, light up a cigar, and fall asleep every night. That was his routine. Um, and my mother seemed to spend 99% of her time in the kitchen. Um, she was not a good cook, um, but she spent an enormous amount of time in the kitchen, either cooking or cleaning up or whatever, washing dishes, drying dishes, putting them away. I used to often help dry dishes, and I enjoyed that because that would be a time when my mother and I would sort of chat, you know. But most of the time, I didn't have that much interaction with them, and I didn't have that much interaction with my brother, although I idolized him. I thought he was the most brilliant person on earth. He was everything that I wanted to be. But I actually spent most of my time with two friends, John Kruger and Jeffrey Arnold. They both lived on the same street as me. We were both the same, all three of us were the same age. We were usually in the same classes in elementary school. And every afternoon we would be together, the two of us or all three of us. Sometimes I would go to Jeffrey's house, sometimes I would go to John's house, sometimes all three of us would end up at somebody's house, or one of them would come to my house. Um, with John, every afternoon, the first thing that would happen is either his mother or my mother would feed us a glass of milk and Tasty Cake chocolate cupcakes, which to this day I love Tasty Cake chocolate cupcakes.
That's good to know. I need to keep that in mind.
They're probably not even good,
They're really not, but they're. It's good to know that now I know you a little bit better.
but it's the memory, you know.
Yeah.
It's something that I did on a regular basis. John had a pool table in his rec room, and he and I would spend hours and hours and hours playing pool, listening to records.
Are you any good at pool?
I used to be.
Are you
I'm not so
still?
good at it now, but with a little practice, I would be.
You know, there's a billiard hall here in Greensboro that me and David was thinking about checking out. Maybe you could tag
Yeah,
along.
I sure. I used to have a pool table when we lived over on Foxglove Lane. I had a pool table in the bonus room, but it wouldn't have fit in here, so I sold it. But I enjoyed that. But we would play pool and we would listen to Leslie Gore singing "It's My Party."
Is that the
Jim,
song like "It's My Party"?
that's the one. Jimmy Soul singing "If You Want to Be Happy."
I don't know that one.
If you want to be happy for the rest of your life, never make a pretty woman your wife. So, from my personal point of view, get an ugly girl to marry you. The principle being that an ugly woman cooks meals on time. She'll always give you peace of mind. A pretty woman makes her husband look small, very often causes his downfall.
Okay.
It was a silly song, but it had a great beat. And the other thing that we listened to, John went to summer camp. I did not go to summer camp. My family didn't have money for that sort of thing. But John went to summer camp, and he loved to act, and he was in a production of The Pajama Game. So he
Huh?
had the original cast album of The Pajama Game, and we listened to that over and over and over again. At one point, I could have sung the whole album for him. Can't anymore, thank heavens.
Would you say were you middle class, upper class, lower class? Like,
We were definitely a middle class family. You know, we had two cars. We had a private home with a two-car garage. Um, I thought we were rich. I used to get a new pair of shoes every year. I would get new clothes for school every year. I get, I thought we were very wealthy. In fact, we were not wealthy at all, but I had no way of knowing that. I thought we were, you know, living on top of the world.
would you say the way you described your family, it reminded me of like Leave It to Beaver. Is that kind of like, was it like the typical American that's kind of like household that's displayed on TV? Would you kind of consider it that
Well, I
as a
never watched
comparison?
any of those shows, so
Okay.
I don't know what the TV shows were like. But I would say we were a typical American family. Um, Never heard my mother and father argue in all the years that we were there. I'm sure they must have, but somehow they managed to do it in ways that we couldn't hear. Um,
As parents often do.
yeah, um, and yeah, my brother and I were both reasonably normal kids. Um,
You say reasonably.
yeah, ADD runs in my family. My uncle Wally, one of my father's brothers, definitely was an ADD case. David is an ADD case.
Oh, I know.
My brother was a very, very bad ADD case.
Are
Um,
you an ADD
but
case?
yes, yes, but if you if you consider it a disease, I got a mild case. My brother got a severe case.
Do
He
you
had
consider it
issues
a
with
disease?
drugs. He had issues with alcoholism. He smoked cigarettes like a chimney all his life. Um, he could not hold down a job. He was very impulsive, made poor decisions, had three bad marriages before he finally had one good one. Um, all the things that go wrong when you suffer from ADD.
Would you consider it a disease yourself?
I would, yes. Yes, a hereditary disease. Because from what little I know of my grandfather, from the things my mother said about him, I concluded that he had it too.
Do you think there were other contributing factors as well, though, that kind of like, I don't know how mental health was diagnosed back in those days, but I can imagine it's much different than it is now. Do you think there may have been underlying or other mental health issues at play?
I don't know. I don't know. That's way beyond my area of expertise. Um, I know that we sought help for David early on, um, and he saw he was in counseling and he had medication, and I'm not sure how much good any of that did or didn't do, but I think as he got older, he developed more self control and um, the ability to avoid knee jerk reactions to things, you know. So I think I think that a person who has ADD can do things for themselves to sort of ameliorate the effects of it. But I do think that that it's a disease, and once you've got it, you've got it,
Okay.
and it ought to be recognized that way and treated like a disease.
Understandable. Um, what are some of the social, national, world events that happened during your childhood and adolescence?
Well, the first one was probably when I was maybe 6 or 7 years old. Um, there are two islands in the Gulf of Japan, I guess, or no, between mainland China and and Taiwan, which in those days was referred to as Formosa. These two islands are called Quemoy and Matsu. And the mainland Chinese were shelling these islands. They were they were bombing them essentially. And I remember hearing about this on the radio day after day, and being terrified that it was the beginning of another world war, because that's what everybody was saying. The Chinese will be the next one to start a world war, and this could be the beginning of it. And that was really scary. Eventually, it went away. Um, Next thing was when I was a junior in high school and Kennedy was assassinated. Um, that's one of those things where you never forget the moment. I was in my gym class, we were playing volleyball, and the principal came on and interrupted all classes and said, "We've just had word that President Kennedy has been shot." They didn't know yet whether he was going to live or die. They just knew that he'd been shot. And life came to a halt for everyone and everything. Um, that weekend, John and Jeffrey and I and Mike Sklar's were in Patty Briggs' living room watching television when Jack Ruby came along and shot Lee Harvey Oswald, first person ever to be murdered on live TV.
That's memorable.
Yes, yes, earth-shaking event. Uh, you knew that Abraham Lincoln was assassinated, but you couldn't believe that that would ever happen again, especially to a good guy like John F. Kennedy. We thought he was like royalty. Next earth-shaking event, an event that changed not just my life but the entire world. 1964. I was listening to the radio late at night, and the announcer said, "I have a song now by a new group named something or other from England." And he played this song, and the song was "I Want to Hold Your Hand" by the Beatles.
Yeah.
And I heard this, and I thought, oh my God, never heard anything like this before. This is like my whole world just changed in an instant by one song. Next morning, I went to school. That's the only thing that people were talking about. Everyone in school was talking about this song that they heard by the Beatles. And it marked the beginning of a whole new era. It was new in a lot of ways, um, because they looked different, they sounded different, they acted different, they had an obvious sense of humor, you know, and they just radiated something that felt so new and so fresh. And it, it literally changed our world.
Hmm. Um, how did those events influence your thoughts, beliefs, behaviors, and or relationships with others?
Well, the shelling of Quemoy and Matsu, um, I don't know. I know how it influenced my thoughts. It terrified me. Um, did it have any long-term effect on me? I don't know. I dislike violence. I've always disliked violence. I dislike the concept of war. Um, I that may have helped shape my beliefs about that. I don't like watching violent television shows or violent movies. I don't like the way our country glorifies violence. I don't like the way people feel, act, and talk about guns. Might have been influenced by that. I couldn't say for sure. Um, the Kennedy assassination, that was kind of a loss of hope. When Kennedy was elected, it was like, we have hope for things to get better. When I say for things to get better, the economy was good. There wasn't a lot of bad stuff going on, but race relations were bad. Black people were still being lynched in the South. They were still being denied the right to sit in the front of the bus or go to or sit in the ground floor of the movie theater. Um, and they they were they were still treated like animals by a large part of our society. And Kennedy seemed to promise an end to that. Of course, nothing was going to bring an end to that. Turned out that Lyndon Johnson was the one that got the Voting Rights Act passed and the Civil Rights Act. He was a much better politician than Kennedy was, but we didn't. We expected all that to happen under Kennedy's leadership, and when he was killed, I thought, no, it's never going to happen. Um, the Beatles brought some of that hope back because their it's like their message was a message of joy. Everything was kind of lighthearted. Yes, they had some sad songs too, but for the most part, it was lighthearted, it was positive, it was upbeat, and it made everybody feel good again. It was also about that time that that folk music became popular in the United States. Two people or one group and one person in particular, a singing group named Peter, Paul, and Mary, and Bob Dylan showed up on the scene and started recording hit songs. So folk music became very popular. I had been playing music all my life, so it only made sense that I would learn how to play the guitar. My brother, for reasons unknown, bought my mother a guitar, which she never attempted to play, but I picked it up and learned how to play it. And my friend John picked up a guitar and learned how to play it. Jeffrey picked up a guitar and didn't quite learn how to play it. But then the three of us and a number of other friends sort of formed a folk music club, and we got together on an almost by senior year, it was almost every night we would get together and we would play our songs and sing and listen to the new songs and learn new stuff. So that had a profound social impact on me because it got me to expand beyond just Jeffrey and John, basically.
So, I know we were just talking about race a little bit with Kennedy and Lyndon B. Johnson and everything. Do you and correct me if I'm wrong, you're Jewish, correct?
Mhm.
You grew up Jewish. How did growing up in a Can you tell me a little bit about growing up in a Jewish household, and also can you touch on how growing up in the North kind of impacted your like view on race and everything?
Well, there were a lot of there were a lot of Jewish people in Livingston where I grew up. So most of the people that I knew were Jewish. We went to Hebrew school together. We went to Sunday school together. We went to bar mitzvah classes together. So um, I did not feel like a minority. Um, there were lots of other people in town that were either Protestants or Catholics or whatever, and I always thought of them as sort of the others. You know, I didn't understand them. I had no idea what Christianity was. They didn't teach anything about religion in elementary school, except for the fact that they taught that there's Judaism and Christianity and Mohammedanism. The Mohammedans were the peaceful followers of the Prophet Muhammad.
Mhm.
That's all that we knew. Um, so, my social circle was mostly Jewish, and to me, that was the world. Um, as far as black people, there were no black people in Livingston, not a one. Um, at one time, a black family moved in, and they only stayed there for about a year and moved out. I assume it's because they felt uncomfortable there. I don't know why. Um, but there were black people in all the towns near us, and um, the only black person that I knew, well, in earlier life, the only black person that I knew was Lucille. Lucille Hammond was a woman who my mother paid to come and clean our house once once a week or once every other week or something like that. Didn't pay her very much, but little money went a long way in those days. Um, Later, when I got older, by the time I got to be a teenager, I would work for my father in his warehouse, and he had a couple of black employees. But these were all people who were working and getting paid and making a living, and I didn't see any evidence of prejudice against them. But I did see that they were more or less restricted to menial jobs. They didn't get the good jobs. The salespeople that called on us, they were never black. At least not until maybe by the time I was in my 20s. Um, I worked for him for a while at that point, and then maybe we might have seen a couple of black salespeople. But when I was a kid, I never saw that. So to us, black people were a class of people who lived in the South and had been slaves and now were being treated like slaves, even though they weren't supposed to be slaves anymore. And more or less everybody felt like, this is wrong and we need to get this fixed.
Can you tell me about your life between the ages of 18 and 25? These years are now referred to as emerging adulthood. Um, can you tell me a little about like, the choices you made in regards to college, work, family, all that?
Sure, sure. I went to Cornell University.
What prompted you to choose Cornell?
Well, it was a very obvious choice. I liked the pictures in their catalog.
I guess it is a little bit different than it is nowadays.
What it was an Ivy
It's a
League
beautiful
school.
school.
It's an Ivy League school, so it has to be good. And the pictures in the catalog looked really interesting. Um, so so
What was the price difference? What did college cost back then? That I am curious about.
my college education, including room and board for 4 years, cost $16,000.
And that was for 4 years?
Yes,
Like 16000
total.
Wow.
Yeah.
I
Today,
can't fathom that today.
today that's what, half of a semester?
That's if you're doing room and board, that's not even a whole semester.
Yeah.
That's literally college on campus with your meal plan and all that. It's like minimum 20,000,
Sure.
and that's like for like the lowest, most basic dorm room you can get. Um, that's wild to think about.
Yeah. Now, speaking about choices, I made probably a very poor choice for a major. I majored in philosophy. This is not a field in which there is high demand. And, but when I was a kid, what they told us was get a college degree and the world will open its doors to you. We heard it literally in those words over and over again. No one ever said study business, study economics, study to be a doctor, study to be a lawyer. It's get a college degree. That's all you need to do. So I liked the idea of philosophy, so that's what I studied. I don't know that I was especially good at philosophy, but it taught me two very, very important skills that in combination resulted in whatever success I had as a business person. Those two skills were number one, critical thinking, and number two, good writing. I had to write a lot of papers in college, and I got good at it. Practice makes perfect.
It does make perfect.
You write enough of them, you get good at them. And later on, um, when it came to developing marketing plans and creating proposals and presenting them and selling them to clients, those two skills came in very, very handy. They proved to be extremely valuable. So it really was not a bad choice, but I sometimes wonder, would things have been different if one of the other schools that I was accepted to was University of Pennsylvania, where I had been accepted to the Wharton School, the finance school, where I
Okay.
would have studied business. And, maybe I would have had a completely different career if I had gone to Wharton. But U of P was in a city and Cornell was in the country, and I liked the idea of not being in a city. So that was the choice I made. And if I had it to do over again, I would probably still make the same choice.
Would you still major in philosophy though?
I believe that if I had life to live over again, I would probably make the same mistakes the second time around that I made the first time around.
Okay.
Because, those choices and decisions reflect who I am. And I don't want to be someone else, and I can't be someone else. So I probably would have done the same thing all over again.
What age did you enter college?
Um, Started college in 64, so I was 18.
18. And you graduated like on the regular track of like.
Yeah, 68,
So
4 years.
you were like 22 or 21.
I was still 21 when I graduated because my birthday's in September.
Right. All right. Well, what about when did you get married?
During intercession of my senior year.
Okay, so you started. Okay.
I was still in college. Annette did not get along with her parents, and she was going to school in Washington. They had moved to Maryland and would not pay for her to live off campus because they were very cheap. They insisted that she live at home, and she was very, very unhappy. So she accelerated her her learning and graduated in January. And we got married in January and went back up to Ithaca, where she worked for the university for my last semester, and I continued taking classes for about a semester. She was paid $75 a week, which after taxes was $72 a week.
Now, how did that last? Because I know groceries and everything was way different back then.
Yes, we,
When I hear 75, I'm like, gosh, that's nothing.
well, it is nothing, and it was nothing then. We had a budget book with money set aside for rent, for gasoline, for whatever various expenses we had. And then we had an other envelope, which was for entertainment and things like that. And
Approximately how much was your rent, if I may ask?
rent was $110 a month. So we had $3 a week in the other envelope. We we used to go to the Victory Market to buy meat because they had the best meat in town. Um, Chopped meat, ground chuck, would have been 29 cents a pound. We ate a lot of that. One day we went there and they had New York strip steaks, which should have been $1.29 a pound. Someone had mismarked them, 29 cents a pound. We bought all 13 of the ones that they had, and I was shaking when we got to the cashier thinking they're going to see that this is wrong and they're going to not let us buy them. But no, the cashier just rang them up one after another. So for the next few weeks, a couple of times a week, we had delicious New York strip steaks for dinner.
That's awesome. How much was gas? Because now gas is like close to $3 a gallon.
Yeah, think I think it was probably in the neighborhood of 30, 35 cents, something like that. I don't recall exactly, but it wasn't a lot.
I wish we could go back to those days a little bit. When things were a little bit cheaper. Um, when did you know that you were an adult?
I'll let you know if I ever know.
Okay, that's a completely valid
I
answer.
really, I don't know. I started acting like an adult um, in June of 1963 when,
Before you went to college.
I'm sorry, June of 1967
Okay.
when I took Annette to Giro's jewelry store and bought her a diamond ring. That was my first adult act, I guess. But being an adult, I haven't quite got that yet.
um, so can you talk a little bit about like your early adulthood? I know you got married while you were still in college. What did starting a family and um, establishing your career and establishing independence kind of look like for you?
Yeah, that is not an easy time. You know, I my first 3 years out of college, I taught elementary school, not because I had a calling, but because it was a way to avoid getting drafted. It was the height of the Vietnam War. There was a draft lottery, and I had a middle number, 181 out of a possible 365. So there was a danger I could be drafted. New York City had a shortage of elementary school teachers, and they created an emergency summer program um, to make people who knew nothing about teaching into quote teachers. Um, they
Interesting.
had 80,000 people applied for this because they knew it came with the occupational deferment. They had room for 8,000. I was one of the 8,000 selected. And we were selected at random. It had nothing to do with our qualifications because with 80,000 applicants and 3 weeks to process them, the guy in charge of the program said, we can't possibly make choices here, so let's just pick at random. So they did. And I got hired and I taught elementary school in central Harlem in a very, very bad school and very bad neighborhood. Taught, taught for 3 years. And when I was no longer eligible for the draft because they ended the draft basically without getting to number 181, um, I didn't need to teach anymore. So now I needed a job where I could make a decent living. Although Annette and I together at that time were earning $13,000 a year.
Which at that time was good, right?
It wasn't a lot of money, but it was enough that we could live very well.
So
We
was
had a
would you consider
small,
that like middle class then?
I guess, we had a small apartment in a nice building on the Upper East Side of Manhattan. Um, she worked for an ad agency. I was teaching. Um, and we could afford to go to the theater once a week. We could afford to eat out 2 or 3 times a week. There was a book called The Underground Gourmet, where it was all the restaurants in the city where you could get a good dinner for $2 or less. So for $2 or less, we could afford it. Um, theater tickets, very seldom did theater tickets exceed $20, and there were usually lots of seats available for anywhere from $2.50 to $6 a seat. So we went to see lots of famous actors on Broadway, great shows. We lived quite well, but we wanted to do better than that. Um, so I went to work for a life insurance agency trying to sell life insurance, and I failed miserably at it. A friend of mine got me a job with a company that sold vending machines. He was doing quite well. I failed miserably at that. Um, then my father offered me a job, so I went to work for him. Um, Worked for him for, I guess, about 3 years. And then um, his company was not doing well, and he would have loved to shut down the division that I was running. And a competitor of his on Long Island wanted to start a similar division. So they suggested, why don't you go interview for this? So I did, and I got the job on Long Island, and I took it, and I worked there for a couple of years, and then got hired by another company for the same job, also on Long Island. We were living on Long Island by then. Um, and then in 1981, um, at that point, I was making, I don't know, probably like 26, $28,000, something like that. Um, and I still wanted, it wasn't enough. We could not, we were living in an apartment.
David was born by
No,
that
no,
time,
at that
correct?
point, we had a house at that point. We bought the house in 1978. Um, Had a house on Long Island. Um, and I saw an ad. I wanted to get a raise from the company I was working for, and they were balking at it. So I started reading the want ads, and I saw an ad for a job in New York that sounded like it was up my alley. So I applied for it and I got accepted. And that was a company called Pinpoint Marketing. And I rose very rapidly through Pinpoint Marketing. Before I was there for a year, I became a vice president of the company. And that was when I started to do well. Prior to that, I had kind of struggled, but um, in probably 2 years of Pinpoint Marketing, I doubled my income. Um, a couple of years after that, doubled it again. And those were the years during which we had our babies, um, made enough money at that point that we could afford to send them to summer camp and the stuff that they wanted to do. We could afford to go on vacations. most of which meant going to Disney World,
Never been.
but,
How was Disney World? I've never been. That's why I asked.
oh, it was fun. It was fun. When the kids were little, it was great. I wouldn't go there as an adult.
I don't know if I would like it because it seems very crowded every time I see videos.
I'm sure it is extremely crowded and it's outrageously expensive these days.
Yeah,
But
I
at that
saw.
time, it was more affordable and it was fun. The kids loved it, and we experienced it through them and loved it. And watching the kids grow up, seeing them go through Hebrew school, get their bar mitzvahs, all that sort of stuff, that was an enormous pleasure. Of course, I was working hard, often long hours, and that often worked too. Sometimes she didn't work, but most of the time she worked too. Um, but we were able to drive nice cars. We never never drove Lexuses and Mercedes, but we drove decent cars, and we were definitely, I wouldn't say upper middle class, but above middle class, lower upper middle class.
Understandable. So in my opinion, middle adulthood, looking at 35 to 65, can kind of be described as a time of, I personally feel like stabilization. You're kind of stable in your career, um, but also at the same time, you're getting ready for retirement at that time. Well, now it's 65, typical age of retirement. What was your adulthood years like?
Well, it was, they were years of watching the kids grow up, years of reasonably well prospering in the business world. Um, Kind of like in young adulthood, you're planting seeds. In middle adulthood, you get to watch them grow and you get to watch them flower and you get to watch the trees turn into real, real trees with shade and leaves and everything, you know. It's really very much about watching things grow, watching your family grow, and beginning to notice that you're getting older. You know, you don't feel it a lot middle years, but it starts to gradually happen. When I was in my 50s, I would go out for a bike ride, think nothing of riding 60, 65, 70 miles a day. In my 60s, I rode 25 miles. My 70s, I had to stop riding, not because I couldn't ride, but because I couldn't see anymore. Um, but but yeah, those middle years are good years. They're years of growth, years of maturation. All your life, you're learning, you're putting things together and making sense out of them. And those are the years, I think, when things sort of come together the best, when you really start to understand who you are and what you're doing and what you've done and what you want out of life.
Um, I feel like later adulthood is a time of reflection. Would you agree with that? Like you're kind of reflecting and getting to look back on like everything that you accomplished, you see your grandchildren, etc.
I don't look back much. Um, I try to live in the present and look to the future. Um, I I don't know how long I'm going to live. You know, I'm 78 years old. I
Hopefully
would
for a lot longer.
I would love to see Addie and my other grandchildren reach adulthood. I don't know if I'll be here that long, but but the probably one of the greatest joys that I could possibly imagine would be attending Addie's wedding. You know, of course, Addie may not want to get married. You never know. Things are different
Funny
today.
enough, she just asked me and her dad are ever gonna get married.
She what?
She asked if me and David are ever going to get married.
And what do you tell her?
Well, me and David have actually kind of been a little bit talking about it, and we discussed potentially getting engaged while I'm still in nursing school, and we would wait to get married until either after I graduate or after she graduates high school. And we told her that, and she was like, "I don't really care what y'all when y'all get married or if y'all get married, just let me plan it."
Well,
Sounds just like her, right?
yes, yes. And when I was a kid, it was automatically assumed that everyone was going to get married and have children. That's just the way it was. And if a woman said, I don't want to have children, there's something wrong with her. You know, today it's very different. People make different choices. Lots of women don't want to have children. Lots of men and lots of women don't want to get married. They don't want that kind of relationship. And, you know, I think people need to respect the choices that other people make. These are personal decisions.
Addie has said that she wants to live on a farm with a bunch of animals.
She what?
Addie has said she wants to live on a farm with a bunch of animals.
Well, a bunch of animals will be more honest than a bunch of people.
Exactly, and I love that. She was like, I was like, so can we come visit you? And she was like, yeah, but you gotta take care of the animals too.
Yeah, milk the goats.
um, what are you most proud of having done or been a part of during your life?
What am I most proud of having done? I am not a proud person. I've done some good things. A lot of people say, I'm proud of my children. Well, I'm proud of my children, but not because of anything I did. I'm proud of them because of what they've done. Um, I'm proud of my lasagna. If I make a lasagna, it's a damn good lasagna, and that's something I can be proud of.
Are you gonna make me one? Are you gonna make us one? I've never had your lasagna.
I don't have any plans right now to make one, but if I had an audience, I might consider making one. Yeah. Um,
No.
I am proud of my needlepoint. Most of my other artwork I'm not, not particularly proud of, but but I don't want to I don't want to be proud. I want to be happy.
I like that. Um, how do you want to be remembered, or what do you want to be remembered for? Like, what's your legacy, and what would you like to leave for future generations?
I want to be remembered as someone who was kind and who made people laugh and feel good.
I definitely think that's what
That's
you're
good
doing.
enough.
You're pretty awesome. If you could go back and change one thing about your life, what would it be? I know we kind of already went over that, and you said there was nothing.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't think I could change anything. I don't think that would be me. Um, yeah, I wouldn't begin, if I could change something, I wouldn't begin to know what to change.
Understandable. And my last question is, what advice do you have for me and other my age? You know, I'm 23, I'll be 24 this year. We're in the stage of kind of like growing and establishing.
Three things: be kind, be truthful, and be trustworthy. I think if you do those three things, that makes that's what it takes to make a person a good person. Whatever else you do doesn't make any difference. You could be a floor sweeper or a nuclear physicist. Um, but the important thing is to be a good person. And I think those are the keys. Um, kindness above all else, but certainly truthfulness and trustworthiness. If you say I'm going to do something and people know that they can count on you to do that, that is worth diamonds, you know. And if you are truthful, then people can rely on everything you say. They know that it's solid, it's dependable. So I think that's what I would tell people. Do whatever you want, but be kind and be truthful and be trustworthy.
Well, that's all the questions I have. Thank you so much for letting me interview you. I feel like I got to know you a lot better as well.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you for doing it. Most people most people more than anything else love to talk about themselves. And most people don't want to hear about about the other person's shtick. So being asked to talk about yourself is a great pleasure.
Well, I am honored that you allowed me to interview you for this assignment. I probably wouldn't have been able to do my assignment otherwise. Um, but honestly, I appreciated it, and
It's been
I feel
fun.
like I learned a ton about you.
It's been fun. Have you ever looked at the book that I wrote that I gave to Dave and to Addie?
Call me,
Call Me Pop Pop?
yep.
Yeah, because if you go through that, it's got much of the same things that we just talked about. Loads and loads of stories about how I lived growing up. And I created that because after my parents were gone, I realized I hardly knew anything about their lives. And I could no longer ask them. There was nobody to ask. They were gone. It was over. And it was kind of sad. So I thought, someday my grandchildren, when they're much older, are going to say, gee, I wonder what it was like for Pop Pop when he was a kid. So that's why I made
Or
that
as
book.
the autocorrect Pip Pop or Pop Pip.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much. If it's okay, I'm going to stop recording.
Sure.